Hi there, this is Jared from Authentic Soundware, and today I'd like to talk about one of my favorite styles of music, space age pop. This video is going to be a discussion about making space age era music in the style of amazing composers and arrangers such as Henry Mancini, Quincy Jones, Les Baxter, and Russ Garcia, but with a particular focus on the amazing music by Esquivel. You might know me from my Space Age Orchestra line of contact libraries, and I'm going to give you a little summary of some of the things I learned about Space Age music as I worked on developing those libraries. But this is not going to be a MIDI programming tutorial or a product walkthrough. We're just going to be talking about the music. First, I'm going to try and broadly just define this style and its sort of key characteristics. Then we'll explore some of the creative and musical devices used by Esquivel and other composers. And then I'll give you some tips you could try and use in your own compositions to help make them just as space-agey as possible. So pour yourself a martini and let's get started. So what is space age pop? Well, it's a genre of music from the late 1950s and early 1960s that blended other genres such as easy listening, lounge, and exotica with futuristic themes. It also is sometimes known as hi-fi bachelor pad music or just lounge music, and it was inspired by the era's excitement for space exploration and invention and new technology. Musically, it draws from big band and orchestral styles, and then it often includes experimental recording techniques, primitive electronic sounds and synthesizers, and it just has this sense of optimism and wonder about the future. First thing I notice about space age pop, and particularly Esquivel's take on it, is that it's a maximalist style. More is more. It's flamboyant and sensational and totally over the top. And there's not much in the way of subtlety and no apologies for pushing boundaries. It's full of exuberance and joy, and there's a certain silliness and even comedy to it. In fact, some people have even described it as being a sort of a sonic cartoon. But while there's a sense of humor in the music, that comedy or joy is crafted with the utmost seriousness as a composition. At the heart of Esquivel's style is his inventiveness and his sense of drama. In his own words, he said, "My trademark is to try and do something that no one else has tried before." Contrast is one of the most fundamental forces of all styles of music, and the use of contrast is like musical rocket fuel for these space-age composers, particularly Esquivel. Esquivel viewed contrast through this sort of space-age lens, and he used it in very specific ways that help define this style. Firstly, when he uses contrast, it's used sectionally. That's to say that the music usually doesn't evolve gradually or sort of build bit by bit like you might hear in sort of cinematic music. Instead, it turns on a dime from one musical setting to a new one with maximum contrast in all ways. As composers, I think we're often used to being told that, quote, blurring the scenes between sections of a composition is, the more sophisticated thing to do and something we strive for. But that's usually not what composers like Esquivel do. They might have one section of music, and then at the next double bar line, there's like a huge change in musical material that is so extreme it can sometimes feel like you're opening the door into a whole other recording studio. And in fact, he actually did that. He often recorded in more than one recording studio simultaneously. So what are some of the specific things we can use as points of contrast when we write space age music? Of course, the melody and harmony will be the main things, but here are some other points of contrast to consider. Dynamic level, so are we going from pianissimo to like a triple forte or louder even? Another good one is color and orchestration, so going perhaps from just rhythm section only to a totally bombastic brass 2D section. Another big one, of course, is tempo and rhythmic feel. Does it feel slow or fast? Which I think I sort of mean more like more active versus less active. Often it'll go from swing to a Latin feel. It could go from a half time to single time, or a single time to double time feel. And then another big technique in this era is metric modulation, which is usually done in a pretty simple way. So maybe we're going from 4/4 to 12/8. So essentially going to a triplet feel and then back to a straight feel. You hear a lot of people like Russ Garcia and Les Baxter take that approach. Other things to consider are the complexity or scale or size versus the simplicity of what you're doing in a given section of your composition. As I was mentioning before, the sort of rhythmic activity or general rhythmic sort of busyness. The orchestral ensemble size, are we going from a small group to a really large group? And also single note melodies versus dense block chords. That's another big way to signal a big shift. Now, as I was saying, composers like Esquivel might have all of those points of contrast change when they move from one section to another. So, for example, perhaps section A is a very soft bossa nova with a solo piano picking out a little melody in a sort of single line. And then we go to like a double time swing feel with a triple forte brass ensemble in block chords plus a vocal ensemble and a lap steel going crazy over top of it. And then go back to that earlier, simpler setting after the B section. Many space-age pop composers, including Esquivel, both composed their own original music and created very unique arrangements of standards from the American Songbook by other composers like Gershwin, Cole Porter, or, say, Billy Strayhorn. While space-age pop does sound jazzy, and compositionally it draws a lot from jazz and big band music, especially composers like Stan Kenton, the defining feature of jazz, namely improvisation, is almost totally absent from space-age pop. This is a composer's genre. It's not an improvising soloist genre. And the composer or the composition is always the star, not a single performer. The melodic statements tend to be simple and concise, with very little underlying counterpoint or countermelodies. And the melodic motifs are presented very clearly without being masked by other musical elements. Some would say they're almost like in your face when they're delivered by a, triple F brass section. If there is a sense of counterpoint, it's often achieved through a simple like call and response approach rather than coexisting musical lines. The music tends to be instrumental or with a vocal ensemble, but rarely solo vocals, and there's usually no true lyrics sung by the vocalists. There's a deep interest in music from other cultures, be it Afro-Cuban rhythms, Brazilian bossa nova, of course music from Hawaiian and Polynesian islands. And another thing you'll hear are these fantastical, spacey, sci-fi intros, and then they just sort of stop on a dime and seg right into a nice bossa nova, and we just move on to some nice lounge music. Les Baxter does that, Russell Garcia. That's not so much of a Esquivel approach there. As I mentioned before, sometimes Esquivel will treat some very silly music very seriously, like in an almost pseudo-classical way. And it's known that he was an absolute control freak about everything. Of course, the other thing is that given that the music was created during a period of space-age technical advances, particularly the invention of stereo recording and playback, there was a great emphasis placed on experimentation with the medium. And actually, Esquivel's album called Latin-esque was given out by the RCA company to customers to promote their new stereo system, since it took such advantage of stereo recording. In terms of the chord choices and harmony, you'll hear lots of sixth chords, bossa nova style chord changes, and then you'll hear a lot of traditional jazz harmony, but it's not too jazzy or challenging for the listener. They embrace corniness and wholesomeness in terms of melodic ideas and harmony, and the clarity of the harmony is essential. There's never anything ambiguous. In practice, you'll notice that tends to mean primarily closed voicings for horns and strings and vocal ensembles. There won't be a lot of extensions added to the chords. It's mainly 6th and 7th chords. Sometimes it's like a 6-9, or maybe a dominant with a natural 9 or a dominant with a flat 9. But there's little dissonance. If there is dissonance, it tends to be used as like a comedic effect, such as a staccato minor second cluster kind of wah-wah, as an effect. Another note about the voicings is that usually only one instrument, the upright bass, plays the root for most chord voicings, unless, maybe the root happens to appear in the melody. But those closed voicings in ensembles in the upper register don't need to have the root tucked under them. So let's talk about orchestration in this genre, because it's a huge defining feature of the style. The brash, contrasting gestures I mentioned earlier are very much enhanced by contrasts of orchestration and color. And the Space Age Orchestra uses an extravagant palette of sounds. There's like this everything but the kitchen sink approach to the orchestration in this style. And Esquivel, in particular, was excellent at adding unique and unexpected additions to the standard studio orchestra that really make his music stand out. So just to go through it quickly, the Space Age Orchestra usually included a jazz rhythm section. That would be your foundation. So that's an upright bass, a drum set, a piano, maybe a rhythm guitar. Then there would almost certainly be a percussion section, which could be a Cuban or Brazilian ensemble. There'd be orchestral percussion like timpani or maybe gongs or wind chimes. There'd be some exotic percussion, perhaps temple blocks or some kind of Polynesian drums or a gamelan or something. And then mallet percussion is also really important, such as vibraphone and xylophone. And then in the brass section, it's sort of coming from a big band world, so there'd be 4 trumpets or 4 trombones, although he did records where he actually had like a double brass section, like in different recording studios, so 4 trumpets and then another 4 trumpets in the other studio. There's a famous record like that. And then also made use of the various mutes for brass, particularly harmony mute and cut mute. Well, actually, and plunger mutes too. In the woodwind section, we're talking about flutes, piccolo, alto flute. I mean, I really think about Quincy in that, with the big band Bossa Nova record. Then you'll hear oboe and English horn sometimes, clarinet and bass clarinet. Saxophones, yes, although it doesn't really come across as a true sort of big band, and I don't hear saxophones as a sort of standard instrument in this world. Then, of course, there's always a lot of strings, but it's a smaller studio size ensemble. You're not going to hear symphonic strings. And usually the bass, there is like no arco bass. The bass roll is handled entirely by the walking jazz bass. You'll hear a harp, an organ, and then the novelty instruments. These are like often used for a single piece on a record, so there might be something like a theremin, a lap steel, or a pedal steel guitar. He was known to Esquivel collaborated with Elvina Ray. Then there's primitive synthesizers and electronic oscillators and stuff. You might hear a whistling soloist or ensemble, or a harpsichord. And then, of course, the vocal ensemble. Most of these guys, like Les Baxter and Esquivel, would use the vocal ensemble. It's almost treated like an instrumental section of the orchestra. They're not like a featured, out front lead thing, like a lead singer. They almost never do lyrics. They certainly don't sing like a whole song straight through. They might have some words here and there, but there's a lot of syllables, zoo, 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 ba, 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 da, da, da. And then the size of the ensemble is pretty small. It's 2 to 4 singers, female, and then occasionally, or about maybe a little bit more than half the time, I don't know, depends on the record, but you'd also have the same number of male singers. And then the last thing is that they do often do little kitschy, spoken, cute phrases just in like maybe one or two moments in the middle of a track. Now, one of the most defining features of space age music, especially as compared to standard big band music of that era, is the interest in percussion and rhythms from other musical traditions, especially Cuban music and Brazilian music. So you'll hear Afro-Cuban percussion ensembles and rhythms like congas and bongos and guiro and cowbells and woodblocks. Then of course, there's a whole Brazilian and bossa nova side to it. And as I mentioned before in the contrast section, lots of feel changes. So by feel, I mean you're going from swing to straight Latin, you're going from single time to double time, you're going from straight eighth notes to a 12/8 triplet feel or something like that. And then polyrhythms and metric modulation, which are really treated in a very clear and almost gimmicky kind of way. They want it, they really want you to get that that's happening. So yeah, definitely pay attention to the percussion section if you're trying to start some space age music of your own. So here are just a few tips. I mean, we've kind of been going over it already, but just some tips for success when you want to set out to compose your own music in a space age pop style. The first thing is use concise, short, and complete musical phrases with lots of space between the phrases. It's got to be clear. And as part of that, you want to avoid complex counterpoint and instead just try simple call and response, maybe between melodies and a counter melody that does an answer. You could try contrasting rhythmic feels between sections, like I mentioned, Afro-Cuban to swing, single to double time, bossa nova to soul twist, something like that. The percussion parts, they're very composed and steady without too many fills or ad-libs, so I think keep that in mind, that they're a foundation. They're not necessarily like a featured sort of drum solo. This last tip just is maybe for people coming from the authentic Soundware side who might be working with virtual instruments in a digital audio workstation. I would just say worry about the mix last. It's, the writing that matters. It's the music that matters. And don't think that putting a filter over your track is just going to immediately take it into that legit retro space age pop sound. It's the music that counts. Just in conclusion, I just wanted to say, I think the reason I'm drawn so much to this space age pop music is because of its bold colors, its optimism, and its huge personality. It's a style that is super dynamic and keeps the listener engaged all the time. It embraces like maximum drama, and it treats even the silliest ideas with complete compositional seriousness, which is something I really appreciate. I think there's not enough humor in a lot of the music that we hear these days. It's also a genre that really celebrates the composer just as much as the performer, if not more so. And as a musician who's not much of a virtuoso on any single instrument, it's a style that allows me to let the orchestra sort of be my instrument. So just to sum it up, I think the key is to be fearless. Don't smooth over the edges or play it safe. Make those hard cuts between sections. Use the entire sonic palette the way Esquivel would. Let your arrangements be theatrical and over the top, and try throwing in an unexpected novelty instrument. On one of my things I added in this weird Acme whistle. But most importantly, focus on the composition itself. No amount of vintage plate reverb or tape emulator plugin is going to substitute for genuinely creative arranging and that space age spirit of trying something that no one else has tried before. So I guess head off and light your tiki torches, pour yourself another martini, and just get out there and make something cosmically magnificent, maybe even something a little ridiculous. I would love to hear anything you do. If you want to send me a comment or put a link in the comments below. Thanks so much for watching.